Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes after people keep trickling in from the waiting room. Feel free to introduce your name and where you're calling in from in the chat as we're getting started. Welcome, everyone. Feel free to drop an introduction, your name, where you're calling in from in the chat. I see Ashley from Fargo, Tara from Chicago, Natalie from California, Carla from South Carolina, Leona from Washington, Denise from Idaho, Sharon from Texas, Heather from Alabama, Phyllis from Denver, Denise from Idaho, Sophia from Delaware, Yolanda from North Carolina. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in another 30 seconds or so. Feel free to keep on introducing yourselves in the chat. All right, it's 2:32. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, my name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the project manager of NLIHC's Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. This is the 9th webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes 2024 webinar series. Our topic today is getting candidates on the record about housing and homelessness. And if you're tuning in for the first time today, I highly encourage you to check out the archive of all of our past webinars on the Our Homes, Our Votes website. We'll drop that link in the chat for you, where you can find the recordings of all of our past webinars. Today's webinar topic, as I mentioned, is getting candidates on the record. We know that to elevate low-income housing and homelessness as an election issue, candidates for elected office must understand that housing affordability and tenants' rights are important to voters. This webinar will explore common methods to get candidates to discuss housing solutions on the record and to educate your network about candidate stances. To get us started, I'll give a brief overview of key considerations for nonpartisanship in candidate engagement. Ariana Jukes at SCANF from Southern California will discuss hosting a tenant-led candidate forum. Madeline Hammerland and Brian Muse from MHP in Minnesota will discuss their coalition's nonpartisan candidate questionnaires. And then Kayla Laywell from NLIHC's policy team will discuss the National Tenants Bill of Rights as a tool to hold candidates accountable. Before we get started on that agenda, I have just a few housekeeping items as always. First, this webinar is being recorded. We'll distribute the recording and links in the next edition of our Friday email newsletter, The Connection, and the recording will be posted on the NLIHC YouTube channel by the end of the week. Second, we have closed captioning enabled. Thanks again to our captioner for being here today. Third, please ask questions using the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. We have a ton of people attending, and it can be hard to catch all of your great questions in the chat, so we're more likely to notice them if you submit them in the Q&A. Speaking of the chat, we ask that everyone engage thoughtfully and respectfully, and to live by the platinum rule, which is to treat others the way they want to be treated, even if that's different from the way you want to be treated. And last but not least, a reminder that Our Homes, Our Votes is 100% nonpartisan, meaning that we don't endorse or favor specific candidates or political parties. Our goal is to build the voting power of low-income renters so we can hold all elected officials accountable to prioritize housing justice. Now, as I mentioned, before I hand it over to our panelists, I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what this means, because it's really important to keep nonpartisanship top of mind when it comes to candidate engagement. As a refresher, 501c3 nonprofits, which are tax-exempt nonprofits, cannot engage in any partisan political activities, meaning they can't endorse or oppose candidates for office, align with a political party, or otherwise attempt to influence the outcome of an election. Doing any of these partisan activities will jeopardize a 501c3 nonprofit's tax-exempt status. What 501c3s can and should do is nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement, which is what our Homes Are Votes and this webinar series is all about. These activities include registering, educating, and getting voters out to the polls, reaching out to candidates to educate them about your organization's priorities, as long as you're reaching out and offering information to all candidates, sponsoring a candidate forum or town hall, again, as long as all candidates are invited and given equal opportunity to speak, and distributing candidate questionnaires, as long as all candidates have equal opportunity to participate. So you're probably noticing a little bit of a theme here. Nonpartisanship requires that all candidates for an elected office are treated equally in terms of opportunities to speak and effort made in extending an invitation or in sharing information. Just to give an example of what this looks like, we recently followed this principle very steadfastly with a set of letters that we wrote to the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee earlier this summer. We urged each party to incorporate NLIHC's policy priorities in its 2024 platform. When we sent these letters, we sent them with identical text. We sent them on the same day to people who hold the same role within each organization. So that's just an example of how strictly we stick to this idea that when we reach out to candidates, we treat them all equally, regardless of party. Now, just because you reach out equally to multiple candidates doesn't mean that their responses will be equal, and that's okay. For example, if only one candidate accepts your invite to speak at a candidate forum, that can be okay, as long as you can demonstrate that you worked as hard as possible to invite the other candidates. Another best practice to keep in mind for candidate engagement is to avoid criticizing candidate statements, although you can respond to them in a neutral tone to add perspective or correct the record. You should never rank or rate candidates. This constitutes an endorsement. What you can do is release a legislative scorecard that compares the voting record of incumbent legislators, but I would urge against doing this in an election year because kind of scoring the voting records of people who are running for office may give off the appearance of being an endorsement, even though that is distinct from ranking or rating candidates. And I'm happy to talk more offline if you're wondering about a specific activity and whether it's appropriate. A safer alternative to this is to distribute a candidate questionnaire that solicits all the candidates' responses to a set of questions related to your organization's mission. You can then publish these responses and circulate it to your community as a form of voter education. One note of caution about candidate questionnaires is that you can't edit the responses in any way. They must be presented to the public just as they were submitted in the questionnaire. And we'll hear a bit more about candidate questionnaires from Madeline and Brian later in the webinar. We can go to the next slide. So again, there's a lot more information about this about nonpartisanship out there. For much more detailed information, I highly recommend referring to the resources from the Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Campaign or the Our Homes Are Votes website. We can drop those links in the chat and we'll include them in the follow-up notes from the call. So with all of that behind us, now let's get into what nonpartisan candidate engagement looks like in action. I will pass it to Ariana to get us started.
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen briefly. Let's see. Cool. Hi, so I'm Ariana Banquet-Jukes. I am the advocacy manager at SCAMP, the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. I'm really excited to be here. So often the work that we do is so local, and so seeing folks from Detroit and Cleveland and Philly is pretty exciting, and it's energizing as we're going into this election season and just in general the work that we do. So briefly wanted to tell you who we are at SCAMP. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated to the creation and preservation of affordable housing in Southern California. So we represent 5 different counties. It's a pretty big swath of land, and our membership base is made up of a diverse group of folks. Generally, it's nonprofit developers but includes government officials, architects, community-based organizations, students, activists, and importantly, and a topic that I'll be exploring a lot in today's conversation, it also includes residents of affordable housing buildings. Briefly, what our mission is, I'll read our mission statement. It's to facilitate development of affordable homes across Southern California by advancing effective public policies, sustainable financial resources, strong member organizations, and beneficial partnerships. And a key part of this, with that ending, beneficial partnerships, is a lot of the coalition building work that we get to do at SCAMP, in particular on Our Homes, Our Votes, and with you all on calls like this. What's really fantastic about SCANF is the access that we have to residents of affordable housing buildings. So we represent developers across Southern California, and with that, we get to interact and build power amongst the renters, the folks who live in those buildings. So the way that that manifests is in the Residents United Network. This is a statewide organization with regional groups across the state, excuse me. So what SCAMP does is we run the Residents United Network, run LA, down in LA, and it's comprised of folks with lived experience who want to be engaged in the political process. They want to share their stories, they want to build policy, and they want to affect change. And so this is an avenue to organize and get them involved. And so we work really closely with Run LA. And one of the ways that we activate that base is through our candidate engagement, which I'm going to talk about today. At SCAMP, we do two main forms of candidate engagement. So we do the forums and we do the questionnaires. And I know we have folks speaking later on about the questionnaire process, but we've had a long history of engaging candidates in nonpartisan candidate forums. They've been on Zoom, they've been in person, they've been at all levels of government. And it's a pretty fantastic way for our members to learn about who's running, and also for people who are running to learn about SCAMP and who the nonprofit developers are. This year, we're really excited to be hosting another nonpartisan candidate forum that has a tenant-led component, and this is for Assembly District 54. This is a state legislature district in LA. So it's not Republican versus Democrat. A lot of the times we're seeing Democrat versus Democrat, and it's in local government politics. I'm sure you all have similar experiences. It's, like the progressives versus the moderates or what have you. But in this case, we're bringing these folks together. It's a very important district in LA that spans a large group, diverse diverse group of neighborhoods, of residents, of folks who live in that district. And so we're bringing people together. We're working alongside various different groups in LA to put this on, and one of those groups being the Residents United Network. So we're doing this as a part of Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, and we're also doing this as a part of what is going to be launched this November, this October, this fall, which is the 1 Million Affordable Homes campaign. So statewide, groups are coming together to call on the legislature to ensure that Governor Newsom and the state legislature actually fulfills their promise of building 1 million affordable homes by 2030. This was something that Governor Newsom said he was going to do when he joined. And not only is he not doing that, but they've cut funding for affordable housing in the state of California. So this is nonpartisan. We're not asking for pledges. We're not asking the candidates to do that, but it's just a part of this power building movement to ensure that we're in the long term and that our candidates, our electeds, are accountable for us down the line. What's exciting about this is I mentioned the resident component. I'm not going to go into details about the logistics of putting on a candidate forum. I'm happy to talk about that some other time, about like the earned media and the coalition building and the question drafting. I will say the questions that we ask are the same for both candidates, and that's what you'll hear in the candidate questionnaire portion too. There's a lot of similarities with that. But I do want to talk about the resident engagement component when leading a candidate town hall. And so there's various steps that we've been taking at SCAMP to do this effectively. And the first and one of the most crucial is resident buy-in. So we host monthly meetings with our Run network. And we ask them, like, is this something you'd want to do? We take a vote, we discuss it, we brainstorm together. And so ensuring that we're getting buy-in is a key part of the process. Another key part is ensuring that we're getting buy-in and support on if we're talking about any ballot measure that's happening, especially when it would maybe discussed at this town hall in some way. So in California, housing's on the ballot at the local level and at the state level. And so we also ensure that the Run members are engaged in those ballot measures and are in support of them before we even discuss or talk about them in a public setting. The next part is brainstorming of the questions. We also will do this with our residents. We've put out a call, we've gotten some questions from them already, and we're going to do this in person on Thursday at our next meeting. So ensuring that it is tenant-led and that their voices and their questions are being answered. We also have a resident speaker component. So at the beginning of our town halls, ensuring that folks need to have the chance to get up and share their story and let the candidates know this is who they will be representing, and that it's important to listen to them. And so here you'll see a photo of Ruby Smith, one of our residents, speaking to Mayor Bass, who was running a couple years ago. And then finally, ensuring that we're sending invites to all the buildings in our district. So we have a long list of all the nonprofit developers and their properties. And we build relationships with the resident services directors at each of those organizations so that in times like this, we can make sure we have easy access to inviting the residents who live in Assembly District 54 to come out, have some food with us, and hear from the candidates who are running in their districts. And then finally, ensuring that there's Run member participation at the forum itself. So asking them, is this something you want a flyer at? Do you want a table at? Do you want to help with volunteering? The folks that we work with are they've been working with my organization longer than I have in a lot of ways. And so any opportunity to interface with the public, they're excited about and they want to take the opportunity to do. And of course, there's stipends, and we're compensating folks for their time in effective ways that are not. That's ensuring that folks are properly compensated for the work that they're doing, and honoring their lived experience while doing it. So overall, why do we do it? Why do we do candidate forums? It's the opportunity for our members and the public to hear about how our candidates will approach the issue to housing and homelessness, right? We have a membership organization. This is a direct line of communication. It's important for coalition building. We do these candidate forums alongside other organizations in the district and throughout Southern California. It's important for there's resident engagement with the candidates, but at the same time, it's another opportunity for us to build the relationships with potential elected officials so that when they get into office, they have a face. They can put a face to the organization. They could put a face to the residents. And so it's once again showing that, hey, this is who you need to be accountable to. So with that, I will wrap it up. So I appreciate it and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Ariana. We really appreciate this kind of insight into what resident leadership looks like in action, and always appreciate Run as a model of that for our network across the country. There are some great questions for you coming in that we will take at the end after we hear from all of our panelists. And with that, I will pass it over to Madeline and Brian at MHP.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Happy Monday. Brian and I are so pumped to be here and share about some of the ways that we are making sure we're bringing housing champions into the Capitol. I am the housing campaign organizer for MHP and the Our Future Starts at Home Coalition.
And I am Brian Muse. I am the Communications and Engagement Associate at MHP.
Absolutely. And thank you. Together, we are realizing some powerful responses for the 2024 Candidate Housing Questionnaire, which we do just want to uplift is co-hosted by MHP, the Our Future Starts at Home Coalition, and Habitat Humanity of Minnesota. Just getting some of that statewide reach and diverse perspectives on what it means to be a housing champion. Next slide. So we just wanted to raise up, why do we utilize a housing candidate questionnaire? We want long-term housing wins, and we want statewide housing solutions. So one of the things we want to highlight is what's going on in Minnesota this election cycle. In 2024, we have 134 representative seats available. That's 134 districts, and one Minnesota Senate, a special election. And so that means we have an opportunity to connect with over 268 candidates here in our state who have the opportunity to make sure that policies align with the values of our community, like safe, healthy homes for Minnesotans, no matter what we look like or where we come from, which is incredibly powerful. This is actually the fourth election cycle that MHP has conducted a housing questionnaire. And some of the strategies behind that are making sure that candidates have an understanding of what are some of the housing issues and barriers Minnesotans are experiencing in our state. Those can be a wide range of issues. So making sure that we're elevating what needs to get done, of course. But on top of that is also recognizing what candidates are offering to their communities as representatives of so many. We need solutions at the Capitol, and we need them today and tomorrow for those long-term wins. The way that MHP developed the questionnaire this year was first we had a draft with internal parties. Our policy director, Libby Murphy, and our deputy director, Elizabeth Glidden, developed a full list of actually, I believe we had originally 10 questions that highlight different area issues for housing across the state. We then transferred it over to provide some partner feedback and revisions. So I'd like to highlight that our lived experience with homelessness committee for the Our Future Starts at Home Coalition had opportunities to review, the statewide organizing committee for the coalition, but also partners of diverse geographies, grassroots organizations, and missions to realize safe, healthy housing here in Minnesota. After that, we took in that feedback, those revisions, and then we developed our candidate resource webpage, which is linked and will be shared with all of you. This includes resources like the candidate portal, where we offer opportunities for all of our candidates to actually complete the questionnaire, a total of 8 questions, but also additional resources that Brian is going to be covering. The next step that we're taking to make sure that we have a full understanding of what candidates are offering to their communities for housing solution is coordinated outreach and response targeting, because we know that we want to have an equitable opportunity for all candidates to respond, but that means we have to be coordinated, intentional, and welcoming to those leaders. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madeline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we coordinate this candidate outreach. Once the questionnaire is actually in the world, what happens next? So the first bullet point I will say is the most important, and it is kind of the philosophy by which we do all these other activities. Direct constituent outreach is always going to be the most powerful thing you can help facilitate. What we've found is you can send emails to all the candidates until you're blue in the face. You can remind them, you can prompt them in all these different ways, but nothing is really going to be as powerful as a person who lives in their district, reaching out to them, having a conversation. That is always going to be the number one way to get responses, but also raise up housing. So we build tools with that in mind. We try to facilitate, and how can we make that as easy as possible for constituents and folks on the ground and our partner organizations to help facilitate those conversations. So one thing we do that is kind of a big hit is the social media toolkit, which is a series of copy and paste tools that link to the website. If you click in there, you can copy and paste a blog post to a partner org and copy and paste a blog post to their website. There's text in there for a newsletter. If they want to make a social post, either generally about the questionnaire or make a post directed at a candidate, encouraging them to fill out the questionnaire. Those are all things that we help to provide to kind of lower that barrier. Secondly, I think it's really important to consider coordinating collective action, and that can be in-person action or digital action. In the past, we have often done Twitter storms or digital days of action, where we kind of coordinate with a larger group of orgs about we're gonna post for 1 hour at 12 p.m. on Tuesday. And so everybody will post a bunch on that during that time, and that will just kind of create a buzz around the questionnaire for, that's a great way to reach candidates. And then another thing is, once the questionnaire is out there, you've done all this work to put it together. Sometimes it's helpful to integrate the questions into candidate forums, like Ariana was outlining. We have many times had partners reach out to us and ask us if they can use our questions in forums. We have reached out to different people putting on forums to ask if they will ask some of our questions. And that is a great way to continue to raise up housing issues, even if it doesn't end with the end result of those candidates filling out the questionnaire necessarily. It achieves a lot of the same goals of raising up those housing issues. And then another thing that's we have found is really important when we're coordinating this outreach is weekly check-in meetings with partners. So me and Madeline in real time are kind of tracking these responses. We are looking at what geographies they're coming from. And then in these meetings, we're sharing that information with folks. So if we realize that in the northwestern part of the state, we're not getting hardly any responses, that can be a great time to coordinate with folks who might be more local to that area or who might know people doing work in that area. And that's just a great way to kind of expand the network and kind of get back to that first point of how can we engage with constituents to engage with their candidates. I will pass back to Madeline.
Yeah, next slide, please. Brian, thanks so much for just sharing some of the ways that we are working to make sure that our questionnaire is both accessible to candidates and to our partners who are making so many of those candidate responses possible. So we view this housing candidate questionnaire ultimately as an advocacy tool. We're looking for two things: lawmaker accountability and lawmaker partnership. And we know that we need both if we want to have the long-term statewide housing wins that we are looking for here in Minnesota. So we want to elevate housing as a priority in the 2024 election, just as we have in the previous 4 election cycles. When we're asking candidates to review what is their housing platform, what are their housing solutions, we're reminding them that home is a Minnesota value. We want commitments to addressing the housing barriers of Minnesotans. So much of what this questionnaire is informing our candidates across the state. What are some of these big barriers to our big housing problems that we're asking them and looking to their leadership to address? We also think about the ability to buoy the good work of lawmakers who are realizing those changes and addressing those problems in the legislative session. In one of our most recent meetings, and just to give us a shout out, we did actually launch our candidate questionnaire last Thursday, which is incredibly exciting. Our next meeting is tomorrow, but we were speaking about the power of knowing what our lawmakers have said they value for housing solutions. Imagine walking in to meet them in the next session, shaking their hand and saying, let's get it done. That's what we're looking for, an opportunity to connect on our shared value of home. We also want to support our partners and Minnesotans advocate for the housing wins in all districts, all corners of Minnesota. One of the best ways to do that is to have an understanding of the ways that lawmakers want to create solutions. What if we can help lawmakers partner with their community or lawmakers partner together to make sure that policy is addressing those big challenges? So when we think about this candidate questionnaire, this is one tool of many that we can continue to move forward into future sessions, into future advocacy. Thanks so much for the opportunity to raise up this one dynamic way that we're trying to make housing a priority here in Minnesota, and looking forward to any questions that all of you have. Have a happy day.
Thank you so much, Brian and Madeline. I really appreciate kind of getting that step-by-step from the genesis of the questionnaire to the ways that you use it to hold candidates accountable. And seeing that role of constituents is really powerful. I'm going to pass it along to Kayla from the NLIHC policy team to speak about the National Tenants Bill of Rights and how that can be a tool for holding candidates accountable as well.
Thanks so much, Courtney. I have some weird lighting in my house, but I got my links ready. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Laywell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing policy analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I just put our National Tenants Bill of Rights materials in the chat, as well as the call to endorsements. So if you've heard this again, please do read more and endorse the platform. I'm joining today to dive into how you can use the National Tenants Bill of Rights in your candidate engagement work. So just a couple months ago, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, along with the National Housing Law Project and the Tenant Union Federation, launched the National Tenants Bill of Rights, a groundbreaking step in shifting power to renters and advancing tenant protections. This National Tenants Bill of Rights was written with direct input from tenant leaders, people with lived experience of housing instability, housing law experts, and advocates nationwide. Our nation's 114 million tenants deserve a safe, stable, and healthy home. And this platform provides a bold legislative framework to enshrine tenants' rights throughout their tenancy, from both private rental housing to federally assisted properties. Now, if you've heard me speak about this before, you know that this is not yet legislation. It has not yet been introduced in Congress, but I and the NLIHC, NHLP, and TUF team are working to build as much support for the National Tenants Bill of Rights in preparation for it to be introduced in Congress starting in January 2025. But again, I'm joining the call today to call for everyone to endorse the National Tenants Bill of Rights and talk more about the National Tenants Bill of Rights adaptability to nonpartisan candidate engagement. So before I get into the 7 rights in the platform, just briefly, a lot of conversations around housing affordability, especially with elected officials and candidates for elected office. A lot of these conversations are focused around building more housing supply, and supply is critical, but it's only one part of the comprehensive set of solutions needed to fix the broken housing market. We also need to increase rental assistance, strengthen eviction prevention tools, and enact robust tenant protections. The National Tenants Bill of Rights provides a model and a legislative framework for doing just that. When enacted, the National Tenants Bill of Rights will help prevent housing instability and homelessness, redress long-standing racial and social inequities, and advance housing justice. So, in order to talk to your candidates about this, you got to know what's in it. So the National Tenants Bill of Rights includes 7 rights as listed on the screen. I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview and put my email in the chat in just a couple moments in case you want to dig deeper into it or have recommendations for what should be added in it. So the first right in the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the right to a fair application. Everyone should get a fair shot in the rental housing application process. Landlords should only consider information that's relevant to an applicant's obligations as a tenant. And this section includes regulations around, tenant screening, which components landlords should consider and not consider on a rental application. And for example, it calls for the complete elimination of unnecessary barriers like rental application fees. The second is the right to a fair lease. Leases shape the entire landlord-tenant relationship and should clearly define the duties and rights of both parties to avoid predatory and deceptive terms. The lease should be clear in plain language that is accessible to the tenants, and it should be free from unreasonable terms like waiving of tenants' rights to a trial by jury in areas where that's already the precedent. The third right is the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment. Our tenant leaders provided robust feedback on this section, and I'm really proud of it. No one should face discrimination, violations of privacy, or harassment in their own homes by their landlords. And tenants should have the tools to prevent and stop such abuses when they occur. To fight such discrimination, we need more funding and resources for enforcement, especially for government agencies like HUD and those tasked with enforcing fair housing laws. We also need clear standards on when a landlord can access the unit and certain expectations for when they do so. The fourth is the right to habitability or a habitable home, tongue twister. When tenants face a health or safety standard or need a repair in their home, they should have a clear way to communicate with their landlord, who should then make a prompt fix. Tenants should have practical means of enforcing their right to habitability. including the right to repair and deduct, and sanctions for owners who fail to comply with basic habitability standards. That's at the tenant level. At the national and state and local level, we need to increase the transparency around landlords and properties. So this section of the bill calls for state and local rental registries with information about owner, property management, and building level information. And the National Tenants Bill of Rights calls for a national database of federally subsidized housing. Tenants should know eviction rates, health standards, and complaints, including property and owner level around environmental hazards. The fifth right is the right to reasonable rent and costs. To protect tenants from financial shocks that put them at risk of eviction, we need safeguards to prevent rent gouging and excessive or hidden fees, including junk fees. This section breaks down fees like security deposits, late fees, extra fees around utilities, and the need for rental insurance, excuse me. Second to last, we have the right to organize. Tenants must have the ability to advocate for themselves without fear of retaliation or eviction from landlords, property owners, and property management. Public housing tenants already have the right to organize, but we need to strengthen and enforce. Well, we need to strengthen that right and provide adequate funding for enforcement and supported activities for that organizing. We also need to strengthen the right to organize and provide it for housing choice voucher tenants, as well as tenants in low-income housing tax credit properties. And finally, the right to safeguards against evictions. We all have the basic right to due process, and tenants should have protections from illegal evictions and evictions without good cause. This section talks about the right to security of tenure, the need for just cause eviction standards, and the right to be free from unlawful self-help evictions. So, how can you use this platform for pushing candidates? I mean, our other speakers, Ariana, Madeline, and Brian, have already summarized really great outreach activities for engaging candidates for elected office, including tracking candidates' policy positions, social media engagement, candidate fora, and questionnaires. And the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the preeminent federal policy agenda to protect tenants now. So I was imagining ways that you could apply those tools that they've already used directly for housing justice candidate forum, for example. You could ask the candidates, of course, all the same questions as they said, but how would you plan to protect renters from illegal evictions? Or you could draft questions based on any specific section or even one right in particular in the National Tenants Bill of Rights. Or use the rights as pillars in an entire housing and tenant protection focused candidate forum. You could ask each candidate for city council, for example, how they would plan to prevent illegal rent hikes by out-of-state corporations. Of course, this is the National Tenants Bill of Rights, but a lot of this builds on the progress that's been made over the last several years from state and local tenant protections advocates, tenant unions, and advocates, many of which are on this call. And we've already had 11 candidates endorse this platform in just the last couple months it's been released. So you can also urge them to endorse the National Tenants Bill of Rights, which will be made public, right? At least the candidates section of which candidates have endorsed the National Tenants Bill of Rights, and then use that to hold them accountable if they are elected into the position in which they're running. So again, thank you, May, for putting up the next slide. We have the endorsement form, sorry, last one. The National Tenants Bill of Rights, again, we're calling for as many endorsements as possible. And unique to this campaign, NLIHC is calling for individuals to endorse the National Tenants Bill of Rights, as well as organizations, elected officials, and candidates running for elected office. We know that housing supply is only one piece, and tenant protections are vastly needed to support tenants in the private rental market, as well as in federally subsidized housing. And the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the preeminent tenant protection platform. So please endorse the National Tenants Bill of Rights, and please do feel free to reach out with any other technical feedback or questions. I'll look in the Q&A now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kayla. We're so grateful for all of your leadership on the National Tenants Bill of Rights on behalf of NLIHC and with our partners and with our tenant network to really make this a strong framework. And I appreciate that kind of framing of how it can be used in terms of applying it with these activities that we've talked about today. I'm now going to open it up. Sorry, I have a phone ringing in the background. 1 second. We're now going to talk about how we can Yes, I appreciate you speaking about how we can apply that in terms of the context of the activities we've spoken about today. I'm now going to take a look at the Q&A and ask some questions. We had a question from Denise on, I think this was geared towards Ariana, but we welcome responses from everyone. How are you compensating community members and for which activities?
Yeah, thanks. So Denise, it's in the terms of, it's by providing stipends, and this is you have to be careful with this, mainly because if you're giving folks, compensation for the work that they do, if they're living in public housing, you have to make sure you're not giving them something that will trigger their income limitations and potentially mess with their housing. One of the ways that we do it at SCAMF is we provide like a living honorarium if you're speaking at an event. So if you're Ruby Smith and you're introducing and you're giving your story to a large audience, you'll be given a living honorarium for that. We do travel stipends, making sure that we get folks to the event and back and forth from the event. This is for our run members, so it's not just all community members at large, right? It's a very specific group of folks who get these stipends. Well, if we're doing voter engagement events at different buildings, we'll also provide childcare or childcare stipends. A lot of the times this is in the form of a Visa gift card. That's a way that maybe makes it easier for us to give them that stipend. And so, yeah, it's a pretty complicated process you have to be careful by, but it's also really important.
Thank you so much. And I'll just add to that NLIHC also has a practice of providing stipends for tenant leaders when they contribute to our blog or speak on our panels to recognize that they are doing labor that they might not be employed for an organization that pays them for it. So we ensure that when tenants who are unpaid are doing that work, we provide a stipend as well. But yes, it's always important to be conscientious for those who are receiving any sort of housing assistance or live in public housing, that we don't want to put them over the income limit and jeopardize that really critical housing assistance. And again, we're always happy to answer questions on some of the technicalities of that. Great. I'm seeing a question from Luce for Kayla in the chat about immigration as a protected class and discrimination, and what can we do with landlords to ensure that applicants aren't requested that applicants aren't kind of forced to provide their social security number. And I know you've done a lot of work on immigrants' rights and housing, so can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Liz. And so, of course, a lot of these fair housing issues depend on how successfully they're enforced. And we heard over and over and over again that a National Tenants Bill of Rights doesn't matter if it's not enforced. And that's why it calls for dramatic increase in enforcement funding for HUD, but also adequate fair housing testing and regular accountability to make sure that in places where there are protections for, no discrimination based on source of income, for example, that tenants are truly protected in those communities, right? It doesn't matter if it's not being adequately enforced by the local jurisdiction. Of course, immigration and other fair housing discrimination, it of course depends on your locality, because while the Fair Housing Act called for 7 protected classes, right? many communities are still being discriminated against because there's a lack of enforcement. So for this specific case and anywhere in your community, I would urge you to talk to your local legal aid for specific cases, and of course to work with your local fair housing organizations so that they continue to be advanced these fair housing protections, and immigrant families are protected and everyone has access to housing regardless of where they come from.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm also seeing a comment from Helene that they've used these tactics in the past and sued for tenants' rights and were successful, and got the municipality to adopt an ordinance. That's really great to hear. And I also see a comment from Tara that they've already endorsed the National Tenants Bill of Rights. So we greatly appreciate that, Tara. We hope that everyone on this call will follow in your footsteps there. I'm also seeing a question about media accountability from Helene and what steps we can take to get the media's eyes on homelessness and housing instability, and to hold public officials accountable through the media. Ariana, I'll pass that one to you.
Yeah, I could take a stab at that. So part of the 1 Million Homes campaign, for the different groups that received grants to put on an event in the next couple of months, one of the requirements was you had to have media at your event. So going kind of back to what Madeline and Brian were talking about with their Twitter storms or like generating a lot of buzz, part of the goal of doing these events across the state at the same time is to generate a lot of buzz. And so there's two ways we're going about doing that for our candidate forum. Is inviting media to be there. And what earned media is, if you're unfamiliar with what that term is, it's basically, it's like free publicity. If you can get a journalist at your event to write about it, that can be very beneficial to getting the word out there. So ideally, if we're having 10, 15 events happening across the state, there will be enough buzz that it can get into the papers, it can get written up somewhere. We're also inviting a moderator that's a journalist. So we've identified a few different on-camera journalists and local NPR journalists, folks that are also big on in LA Times to be the moderator at our event. And a part of this, Helene, is to be holding our candidates accountable, because if it's written down in paper and we're getting that media attention, later on down the line, we can point to that and say, look, you talked about this at this candidate forum. How can we hold you accountable moving forward?
And I'd just like to jump in. I know it's not earned media, but again, we recognize that one of the most powerful ways of motivating lawmakers to align values and actions is that spirit of appreciation. So it's not only about asking candidates to complete our questionnaire through social media, but also recognizing the great work that they're doing. And so appreciating the time that they spent sharing what they're going to do to make Minnesota a better place to call home. And so we're using a couple different ways, Facebook, we're thinking about blog posts, but I just got to be myself. You also have me thinking about LTEs, the power of Minnesotans, raising that up as an opportunity. So yeah, excellent.
Thanks so much, Madeline and Ariana. Yeah, I think showing that appreciation for candidates for taking the time, no matter what you're doing, no matter what their stances are, just recognizing that campaigns are busy, and showing that gratitude to them for showing up or writing an answer to the question makes a really big difference. I'm seeing a few questions or comments about accessibility and disability rights organizations. And I think that raises a really important point around these forms of engagement. So could you speak to, whoever would like to take this question, how your candidate events and outreach and communications to your network are made accessible for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So MHP, Our Future Starts at Home. We are so fortunate to have really powerful partner organizations who really have a deep understanding of what it means to make our work accessible. One of the partners I want to raise up is actually the ARC of Minnesota. They are hosting candidate forums across Minnesota, and they're going to be utilizing the questionnaire that we co-developed to actually make sure that housing is present as a priority in those candidate forums as well. And so we know that there are all types of ways of making sure that this is an accessible advocacy tool. And so one of the things I also want to raise up is all of the candidate responses are shared on the MHP website for all Minnesotans to access, review, and utilize when they're meeting with their housing champions at the Capitol. So those are some of the steps that we've taken, making sure that are at the beginning of the process, we're getting that feedback, making sure that it's being integrated in an accessible way, and that it remains available to all Minnesotans.
Ariana, did you want to add something to that?
No, I just think it's like flagging a very important point, ensuring that whenever we're doing a candidate forum or we're doing it in a location that's accessible, that has what Joanne had mentioned, elevators in place, ramps in place. There's other ways that we're incorporating accessibility. Language accessibility is a big part. So we ensure that we have interpreters at places if we're translating materials. I mean, Courtney, what's so great about NLIHC is that a lot of the materials that you've sent over to us have been translated into different languages, especially in a city like LA, where you have so many different languages spoken at home. And so, yeah, there's accessibility means a lot of different things, and we try to ensure that we're being as accessible as possible at our events.
Thank you. We also got a question about transportation, especially in a rural area. Transportation is a big barrier. So how do you overcome that barrier while recognizing that there can be a lot of costs associated with that? Now, Ariana, I know you mentioned that you provide assistance with transportation for Run members to get to events. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different because we are in a big city, but it is a big city. So folks are coming, an average driving time in LA is like 35 minutes for everything, it seems. We provide reimbursements for folks who take public transportation. At times, we will get Ubers or Lyfts for community members. We'll do carpooling. What's great is that a lot of folks do live close to each other in certain parts of the city, and so coordinating amongst folks to get them to drive together is something that's been helpful.
Great, thank you. I'm also seeing a question about this Congress and what opportunities there are for legislation, which is switching gears a little bit, but I think very relevant to this conversation around election season and what we can expect. I know that a lot of elected officials, including the entirety of the US Congress, are kind of busy in campaign mode, not quite as focused on the day-to-day of legislating in DC. So my sense of the outlook is that things are pretty quiet in Congress, but we're always pushing on the federal budget and pushing for the maximum possible resources for housing and homelessness programs, and to push back against any potential cuts to the programs that we care about. So that is always an area of focus for NLIHC, and we provide a lot of tools that you can use to advocate. So I can drop some of those in the chat momentarily. It's also August recess, when members of Congress are back home in their districts, which is really a prime opportunity for advocacy, both on that short-term work around the federal budget and longer-term work around some of our priority legislation and issue areas, including the National Tenants Bill of Rights. So there's always a lot of opportunity for advocacy, even when we're not expecting a whole lot to get passed in Congress within the next few weeks. So I appreciate, thank you, Kayla, for dropping the link to our kind of latest summary of what's happening up to the minute in Congress in our memo to members and partners, including our advocacy tools. And thank you to the person who asked that question. Kayla, is there anything you wanted to chime in there about what's happening in Congress?
I think that's about it. It's going to be a tough, we're likely to see a supplemental bill about in regards to the appropriations process this year, and a lot of buildup and momentum in fighting for a tax package starting in 2025. So stay tuned.
Thank you. I see a few questions in the Q&A that are about specific states and how to do nonprofit housing or to get funding for shelters or their housing authority in those states. I recommend reaching out to me or to your NLIHC field team organizer to get connected with our state partners in those states so you can learn more about the specific programs that are available in your state or region. I'll also put Ariana and Madeline and Brian on the spot. Their organizations are part of NLIHC's state partner network or state and tribal partner network. So you may be interested in reaching out to them and connecting offline about those opportunities. Okay, just scanning to see if there are any additional questions that we are going to take right now. See. Oh, and thank you. My colleague Thaddeus dropped the map from our NLIHC field team. So if you click that link, you can see who is the main point of contact for organizers and advocates in your state. I see a question from Joanne. Are we working on getting right to representation laws passed for tenants facing eviction?
So I can answer that at SCIF, not directly, but because we're focused on the affordable housing development side. But that said, there's a local effort happening in LA County that we're working on, a ballot measure called Measure A, that is to fund affordable housing development, homelessness services, and tenant protections. So going along the lines of what you're mentioning, Joanne.
Thank you so much. We also at NLIHC have our state and local innovation team that is working on supporting and connecting states and localities working on a number of tenant protections. So we can share the link to the work that they're doing. And I know they have a ton of resources around different policy priorities, including right to representation. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're getting started on advocacy around that issue. And Mrs. Brown asked if this deck will be forwarded. Absolutely. We will have this all shared, the recording, the slides, the links shared in the chat in our Friday email newsletter called The Connection. We'll also have it all posted online on our Homes Are Votes website by the end of this week. All right, so I think we have about 3 minutes left. Again, thank you to all of our panelists for the insights that you shared today, to our attendees for so many great questions. Okayla also noted in response to Joanne's question that the right to counsel is included in the National Tenants Bill of Rights. So that is one of our top priorities. We can just take the last 2 minutes to talk about some opportunities to get involved with Our Homes, Our Votes beyond the webinar series. We appreciate you all taking the time to attend the webinars and also know that there is much more work to happen in the remaining few months before the election. So I'm just going to jump into a few of those opportunities to get involved. We have our Homes, Our Votes affiliates network, which is a group of nonpartisan organizations that are committed to carrying out this campaign's goals of boosting voter turnout among low-income residents and elevating housing as an election issue. If you're on this call, you are most likely part of the network of people that is eligible to become an affiliate. That includes advocacy organizations, direct service providers, resident councils and tenant associations, local governments, really anyone who shares our campaign mission. We have a listserv for affiliates where we share announcements and opportunities related to nonpartisan voter engagement, and we have some enhanced access to Our Homes, Our Votes tools and resources for affiliates. So we'll drop that link in the chat where you can sign up if you haven't done so already. We can go to the next slide. I also want to make sure that everyone knows about TurboVote, which is our one-stop shop where voters can register to vote, update their voter registration, check their voter registration status, sign up for election reminders, and find nonpartisan election information for their community. Sharing the link to TurboVote is a great way to promote voter registration in your networks, both online and in person. And if you have any questions about best practices for using TurboVote, feel free to reach out to us. I'll also note that this tool is available in both English and Spanish. We can go to the next slide. Our Homes Our Votes also has a comprehensive resource library with tools and templates that you can use to launch or strengthen your own nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement work. This includes some resources that are very relevant to what we discussed today around candidate engagement, including a sample candidate questionnaire and some tips for doing nonpartisan candidate outreach. And we'll drop the link where you can find those resources. We can go to the next slide. I've also noted before on the webinar series, and will continue to flag for anyone who's new, that Our Homes Our Votes is a proud partner of National Voter Registration Day, which is a nonpartisan civic holiday dedicated to celebrating and uplifting voter registration. It's coming up quickly in about 1 month on Tuesday, September 17th. And we encourage everyone on this call to sign up as a community partner. Community partners receive access to exclusive training webinars and free swag from National Voter Registration Day. And we'll drop that link to sign up as a partner in the chat. That's a perfect segue to the topic of our next webinar, which will take place on Tuesday, September 3rd at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Note that this is on a Tuesday rather than our regular Monday time slot because of Labor Day. And this webinar is titled Celebrating the Civic Holidays. It will cover how and why to celebrate the national nonpartisan celebrations of voting and elections, collectively known as civic holidays, that are taking place this fall, which are National Voter Registration Day, National Voter Education Week, Vote Early Day, and Election Hero Day. You can find a description of the next week's webinar, and again, the recordings and slides and links from all of the past webinars on the webinar archive page that we will share again in the chat. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. Thank you all again for being here today. Wishing you a happy end of summer. I'll also note that NLIHC's offices are closed next week. We have some time for rest and rejuvenation. So if you have inquiries for us, please send those to us this week. If not, we will get back to you when we return to the office in early September. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks, Courtney.
Bye.